By now, I'm probably a familiar face to many of you, but just to remind those who are in attendance who haven't met me before, my name is Alex Barna, and I am the outreach coordinator for the Center for Middle Eastern Studies here at the University of Chicago. Thank you all for coming. We're really thrilled that you're here. I do have a quick announcement to make. Some of you may have noticed that it's a bit chilly in here. And in order to keep the heat in the room, we're going to try to keep the doors to the hallway closed. So as you enter and exit, just make sure that A, you try to do so quietly when someone is speaking, and B, we keep them closed so we trap the heat in the room to try to make the climate a little bit more comfortable. I'm very pleased to introduce our next speaker, who is Amanda Friedeman, and she is the Harvey L. Miller Family Youth Educator at the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, where she oversees training and supervision of the museum's 200-plus volunteer docents, the Speakers Bureau of Holocaust Survivors and second-generation speakers, and programming for students, educators, and families. She also serves as lead facilitator for the Brill Law Enforcement, Democracy and Action Initiative, which provides training for all Chicago Police Department recruits and promotional officers, as well as suburban and Cook County law enforcement officers. She holds a BA in Art History from Princeton University and an MA in Art Education from the School of the Art Institute of Chicago, with emphases in museum and community-based programs, interdisciplinary curricula, and visual literacy. Please join me in welcoming Amanda Friedeman.
Good morning, everybody. Good morning. You know, I never attended the University of Chicago, but I always thought it would be cool to teach here. Now I have. How awesome is that? So this presentation, I feel like, is actually going to be a really nice follow-up to what we just saw. During Milos's amazing talk this morning, especially in that first 15 minutes or so, every point he hit on about why film literacy and teaching about films is so essential for our students, every single point he made dovetailed with a reason that we need to be teaching Holocaust and genocide education. And so it was like, yes, this is perfect. And so what I'm going to do with you today, you've heard the theory, you've heard the rationale this morning, and so I'm going to take you through some concrete resources that you can use, that you can take right into your classroom, and that hopefully will create meaningful experiences, both in terms of learning to understand, decipher, and deconstruct video footage and film, but also to tie into Common Core and foster critical thinking and all the things that we want from our students. And just right off the bat, I'm going to tell you every resource that I'm showing you today is available online and completely free. So I am a firm believer that there is nothing more cruel than showing teachers an amazing resource that they cannot have. So everything that you're going to see today is available for use in your classroom. I was going to say starting tomorrow, but starting on Monday. And so all of the links are going to be on the screen and are also in the materials that you have. So diving in, hopefully this is going to work from a distance, please. It's working a minute ago. Is it on? It is. I'm going to turn it off and turn it back on. I swear it was working a second ago. So Esther, if you could click for me. My lovely assistant, thank you. So why Holocaust education? Do any of you currently teach about the Holocaust in your classrooms? Excellent. So we've got a few. That's great. Even for those of you who are not necessarily social studies teachers, not teaching 20th century history,
this is still a valid and important area of study. I realize I'm biased in terms of the importance of Holocaust education,
but this is still an area of study that can take your students into some really interesting areas of higher level thought, deeper learning, social emotional learning, character education, civics education. The study of the Holocaust is actually a fantastic way to meet the new civics mandate that we have in Illinois.
So even if this isn't normally part of your curriculum, please bear with it. Next, please. as I said, critical thinking. I got ahead of myself, go ahead. And as Milos was saying, when we study film, we learn to develop nuanced judgments, and
we address subjects that require complex understanding.
People often approach the Holocaust thinking that it's a very black and white story. There are very well-defined good guys and bad guys. The deeper that you go into this history, the more that you learn that it is truly a world of gray. And understanding motivations, understanding why people are making the decisions that they're making is a really valuable lesson for our students, and how to understand and analyze that gray without making judgments, with trying to develop what we think of as historical empathy. It's also an incredibly rich topic to learn how to deconstruct visual media, how to understand the point of view, the perspective, and the propaganda aspects of what we're looking at. Next. Historical empathy. This is something that's very much a buzzword in the social studies world right now, but we can't ever put ourselves in the shoes of someone who lived in the past. We can't understand what it was like to truly be in the positions that these people found themselves in, but what we can do is foster empathy and try to understand the circumstances and the world and the chaos that they found themselves in, so that we can develop empathy to not to decide how we would have acted in that situation, but to think about why they acted the way that they did. Again, not to develop judgments, but to try to truly put yourself intellectually into a position so that we can develop historical empathy, which then hopefully helps us to engender empathy in the world around us, empathy in the present. And this is subject matter that transcends, as Milos was saying, that transcends geography, language, culture, chronology. The Holocaust happened to our students in the ancient world, practically. The 1940s might as well be the Middle Ages. But there are people among us who lived through it. This is not ancient history. And so how do we form those connections? And the use of both historic video footage and video testimony from survivors are two really effective ways to do that and to help our students to make those connections. Next, please. And all of this together fosters global citizenship. It helps our students to think beyond the block that they live on and to see themselves as part of a larger human community. And what I think is actually the least important of the items on this list, Holocaust and genocide study in the state of Illinois is mandated content. So the reason that's important is that if you get pushback from a principal, from parents, you can point to that. But all of the other reasons for doing this to me are far more compelling, but it's there, that last one is there if you need it. Next, please. So why should we be working with survivor testimony? There are plenty of books that have been written, there are movies, you can pop up Schindler's List on the TV and be done with it, right? Well, not really. When you can do that, absolutely show your kids Schindler's List, no problem. But we need to give them broader context, and we need to help them to understand these events that are so massive in their scope that it's hard for adults to wrap their brains around. And survivor testimony is a really effective way to give students a point of entry by understanding the experience of one person, by taking that number we all know, that 6 million, and helping them to see that 6 million is made up of 1 plus 1 plus 1. And these were events that were happening to individual people, caused by other individual people making choices. And when we can return it to that human level, not only is it more relatable, and so our students can connect, but also we begin to rehumanize the victims. One of the first steps in genocide is dehumanization of an aspect of the population, stripping away people's humanity stripping away the idea that individuals who belong to a particular group have different or lesser rights and reason to live than the dominant group. When we can reassert the humanity of those individuals, we break down the mindset that allowed this to happen. Next, please. So, as I pretty much just said, we put human face on this massive event. When you start talking about millions and millions and millions of people, your students are going to check out. They can't absorb that. But they can learn about a little girl named Fritzy or a little boy named Aaron, and they can understand what that person experienced and use those lessons to extrapolate out. These people are still alive, many of them. The ones that aren't with us any longer were alive not that long ago. This is not ancient history. This is, now we're getting to the point where this happened in our students' great-grandparents' lifetimes as opposed to their grandparents, but that's still not, we're coming up on the 75th anniversary of the end of World War II. When you're 14, 15, 16 years old, again, ancient history, but in reality, a very, very small window of time has passed when we think about history as a whole. Next. And already discussed rehumanizing victims and survivors, but this is, once any of us have learned the story of a survivor, we have, I believe, a moral obligation to share it and to tell that story and to keep that person's memory alive. That is the number one tool that we have to rehumanize the victims of the Holocaust. And so you, through your use of survivor testimony and your use of film in your classroom, can be an important piece of that effort. So I'm going to give you some examples of some survivor testimony. This is there's an incredible online exhibition through the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. It's called Some Were Neighbors. And I wasn't originally planning to talk about this today, but I ended up, after listening to Milos, I ended up frantically adding it in to my PowerPoint, because this is an exhibition that is entirely about those moral gray areas, that complexity of understanding that we've been talking about this morning. And the online version of the exhibition is made up almost entirely of clips of survivor testimony and historic archival video footage. So there are two clips from this exhibition that I want to show you. Can you skip ahead a little bit? So it's from, we've been talking about acronyms today. So the Illinois Holocaust Museum and Education Center, we refer to ourselves as IMEC. And even though they don't like it when we do it, the U.S. Holocaust Museum, we refer to as USHM, USHMM. They hate it when we do that, so I'm really glad this is on camera. But this is an exhibition, it's called Some Were Neighbors, that is specifically about collaboration and complicity during the Holocaust. So not the clear-cut definitions of victims and perpetrators, but those people in the middle, and how do we understand their role, how do we understand their motivations. And so the first clip that I want to show you is a testimony, a very short excerpt of testimony from a woman named Fritzi Fritschall. She was originally from a border region of Czechoslovakia that during the 30s and 40s was sometimes Czechoslovakia, sometimes Hungary. It kind of depended on the day or the year. And her hometown now actually is part of Ukraine. So that gives you a sense of where in the world she's from. She was deported to and ultimately survived Auschwitz, and she now serves as the president of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. But everything that I just told you, is a very nutshell bio you can give your students to set up this clip. There is literally nothing that I just said there that your students can relate to. There's nothing that reflects their own experience. And so the excerpt of Fritzi's testimony that I've chosen to share with you today is something that I think will help your students to form that connection. This is a clip of Fritzi talking about the day that she was denied entry to her classroom. It's in her basically the equivalent of junior high, because she was Jewish. So if we can play that first clip.
My first recollection was when I went to school. The night before going to school, my friend who was not Jewish, she and I slept in our home, slept in the same bed, played as children do. And I remember my mother opening the door and telling us to go to sleep because we were being noisy, and the next day was school. She and I got up in the morning to go to school one morning. When we came to school, she was allowed to walk in, and the door was closed to me. I was told I was not allowed to walk into class anymore. I needed to go home because I was Jewish. A teacher, who was my teacher, who took out a white handkerchief from his pocket the week before to wipe a smudge off of my face, turned to me one day and told me I must not come to school anymore. All of a sudden, for whatever reason, I needed to go back home and not come back to school. I remember going home and crying and not understanding why I was not allowed to go to school anymore. A few minutes later, my two brothers came home crying. They too were sent back home and were told not to go to school anymore because we became, quote, Jewish overnight. My mother had to sit down with us and tell us the facts of life. Tell us why we were not allowed to go to school anymore. Tell us that the country was invaded by a man called Hitler, who was a bad man. We did not know about the killings at that time, at least I didn't. But we were told that there were certain rules we needed to follow from now on. And one was not to go to public school.
So that clip is just over 2 minutes long. And yet, how much material for discussion with your students is in there? You have the one wise guy in the back of the class. I'd love it if I didn't have to go to school anymore. But even that provides an opportunity for conversation, right? And, you know, yes, that was filmed, that testimony of Fritzi's was filmed in the early 90s. You can tell from her fashion statement. But this is an opportunity for students to connect the concept of the Holocaust with video footage in color, right? We all think of grainy, black and white, 1940s, almost home movie style footage. But the Holocaust happened in color. And these type, even though this is a modern interview,
this is an opportunity to broach that subject, to get your students to understand that as these events were happening, the people living through them, number one, were not speaking English, and number two, were not seeing the events unfold in black and white. What is the significance of those two factors? How do you engage your students around those points of fact? I think that is a fascinating conversation to have, particularly with that kind of 14, 15, 16-year-old student who thinks they have it all figured out, and then you blow their minds. There's one other, we could go through the entire Summer Neighbors exhibition. It's an incredible wealth of resources. There's a clip I'm not going to show you today, but that I actually used yesterday in a law enforcement training. That is, again, it's actually even shorter than that. It's only about a minute and a half long. But it's a gentleman who survived a forced labor camp, talking about remembering that the commandant of the camp singled him out for verbal abuse, would yell and scream at him, and was horrible to him when anyone was looking. And he forced this prisoner, this gentleman, to come to his office twice a week to clean it. And the whole time he was in the office, the commandant was stomping around and screaming and kicking the walls and demanding that every crumb be picked up, every inch of that office be spotless. And the whole time the door was closed as he was raging, because while this was happening, the prisoner was underneath the desk eating the bread and sausage and milk that the commandant had left for him to help keep him alive. When we're talking about moral gray areas, it doesn't get much more nuanced and complex than that. But I do want to show you one other clip from this exhibition.
That is the second tab. This is silent footage, so there's no sound here. It's a little bit tricky to, it's a little grainy, a little tricky to see, but if you want to go ahead and play it, I'll kind of narrate what's happening. So this, unfortunately, it doesn't enlarge as much as we would like, but this is footage shot in an occupied area of Western Poland during the war. The two young people that you see are a young Polish woman named Bronia and a German boy named Gerhard. They were dating. They had a relationship. And what the footage we're about to see is the two of them being marched through the town and publicly shamed for intermingling German and Polish ethnicities. And what's interesting about this is they are pretty stoic. They hold up to their punishment pretty well. But what you see is the townspeople who knew the two of them, who lived among them, treating it like a holiday. We just saw the little boy marching down the street with a trombone. We see people accompanying them. They are having their hair cut, their heads shorn, and you'll see Gerhard in particular, they rub salt into his scalp, both to cause pain and symbolically the way you salt the earth. Nothing will ever grow here. The fact that this film was created, who shot this, what was the purpose of this, why does this footage exist, is a really powerful conversation to have. This is propaganda, right? This is showing, the incident itself is propaganda showing the townspeople what will happen to them if they violate these taboos. But the existence of the video means that there was a much larger intended audience. That this is what will happen to you if you don't fall in line. And Bronia and Gerhard were teenagers. They were 15, 16 years old at the time. These are this type of footage, and again, this is, and here we see their hair actually, after being shorn, is then set on fire in front of them. So just the layers of humiliation and punishment and just going beyond what could even remotely be considered necessary, if any of this is necessary in this situation, I think is really fascinating in here. They make a parade out of it. When you're talking about moral complexity, when you're talking about ethical gray areas, when you're talking about how people make decisions and choose the actions that they're going to take, this is incredibly rich material to be used. Just very briefly, following this incident, Bronia, the young woman, was sent further east to a labor camp and never returned. No trace of her was ever found after this incident, and Gerhard was subsequently drafted into the army, was severely wounded at the front, and died shortly thereafter. So I didn't intend coming into this to be quite such a downer today, but that's a very short, very simple piece of film. But even if you're not specifically teaching about the Holocaust, that is a rich vehicle for discussion on a wide range of subject areas with your students. So we can flip back. And let's jump to the next slide, yeah. So for those of you who want to really dig into these issue areas with your students, there's an amazing resource called Eyewitness. It was developed by the USC Shoah Foundation, part of the University of Southern California. The Shoah Foundation originally began, it was originally established by Steven Spielberg. After filming Schindler's List, he started a foundation to record and document survivor testimony,
which he then eventually turned over to the University of Southern California. And they created an online resource that is completely free to use in your classroom, that uses testimony from Holocaust survivors and survivors of other genocides. They're starting to incorporate testimonies from Rwanda, a few archival testimonies from survivors of Armenia. Many different global events are starting to be incorporated. It's still primarily Holocaust, but we're seeing more and more other topics addressed. This we can just keep going. I shouldn't have bullet pointed this. So what's really amazing, I'm going to give you a quick walkthrough of the website itself. You can sign up. It's totally free. You just register for an account, and your students can register for an account. There are thousands of hours of survivor testimony that are keyword indexed to the minute, which I can't even imagine the process that went into doing that. But so if you're studying something and you want to know how a teenager experienced hunger in a ghetto in Lithuania, say, type in those keywords and it will give you a list of testimonies queued up to the minute when the survivor begins talking about that specific subject. So you can get comparative experiences, you can hear from multiple survivors, you can get very, very specific information out of these keyword searches. There are also activities built into the platform. There are what they call info quests, where your students go through answer a series of questions using the resources embedded in the website, reading biographies of survivors, watching clips of testimony, looking at maps, gathering information, and creating interpretive output for you. But one of the really exciting pieces of this website is the ability you can create activities for your students where they actually collect both testimony footage using these keyword searches and pull from a library of archival footage to create their own documentaries on this subject. And so you can give them a topic, give them a theme, point them toward whatever resources, however you want to narrow it, and then they generate a short film. One of the things that I love about the platform for this activity is that before your student, as they're logged in their own account in this platform, before they are allowed to start that project, the mandatory first step is that they take a short webinar on ethical editing. And so it talks about being careful about sound bites, about taking information out of context, about understanding the intent of the original footage, what you intend to do with it, and making sure that those match. In the world we live in today, understanding the larger concept of where a 12-second piece of video came from might be the most important life skill we can ingrain in our students. And right? And this is a platform that is designed specifically to almost force them to think about those issues and to be very aware of ethical editing. So, and you can also, there are thousands of pre-generated lessons and activities that you can use and assign to your students. There is also the opportunity to create new content, and if you have a topic or something that you're working on, you can create a custom lesson for your students. So I'm going to break the rules a little bit. I'm going to come down away from the mic, and I'll use my teacher voice, and hopefully you'll all be able to hear me. Give a holler if you can't, and I'll try to yell, because I just want to show you a couple of things on the website so that when you're ready to dive in on your own, you'll have a little bit of context.
Yeah, Alex knows the hardest thing for me when I'm presenting is standing still, so I'm really excited about this. So this is the Eyewitness website. This is the main platform. You can, here, I'm already logged in, but there'll be, when you come to the site for the first time, there'll be a place where you can create a free account. All you need is an email address and a password. But the two areas that are most, I think, important for you are up at the top, the Watch tab, which takes you into these testimonies. There are certain kind of frequently searched keywords that they have queued up right off the bat. And then you can also search, using the search box, you can put in your own keywords, search for your own testimony. The majority of these testimonies are in English, but not all of them. So if you have students who speak other languages or you want to work with language skills, there are non-English testimonies available. And then in the activities section, you can see there are currently 285 that are showing up that are on topics ranging from, again, not all of them in English, but you can filter for that. But there are activities related to specifically Holocaust topics. There are many that are related to United States civil rights, to the 50s and 60s era, and looking at understanding that the Holocaust and the civil rights era were not equivalent, but there are certain commonalities that we can help our students to understand about issues related to stereotyping, equality under the law, resistance, people standing up for what they believe in and getting results. Most of these activities are designed to be done online through the website, but there are also opportunities for offline work as well. This is a brief activity that is examining, it's intended for junior high, 7th and 8th grade. It's about a quick one class period, 30-minute lesson about the experience of a survivor named Aaron Elster, who lived in the Chicago area, passed away last year. But you can actually download I'm not going to do it right now, you can download all of the elements of this activity, including a video clip of his testimony, a lesson plan for you, an overview, and then a worksheet for students to complete as they're watching the testimony. And so not every classroom is super high-tech and fancy, and so this is something that you can actually generate and implement locally as long as you can download the materials ahead of time. So it's a very flexible resource that I really encourage you to dig into and explore and play with, because the possibilities here are really endless. And I'm going to head back up because I've been yelling a lot. And this way you can all hear me a little more easily.
So what we've been talking about so far, yeah, this is great, have been testimonies from survivors, interviews that were conducted about their experiences, and archival historic video clips. There's also an amazing, completely free resource for short documentaries about Holocaust survivors. So Esther, if you could look through. The Jewish Foundation for the Righteous is an organization based in New York that has a twofold mission. They provide financial support to now elderly individuals who risked their own lives to help save the lives of Jews during the Holocaust. and have been named righteous among the nations by the Israeli government. So this is a very select, small group of people, but the thing people don't often realize is that these individuals, the righteous, after the war, stayed for the most part in their home countries and were often shunned or persecuted or continued to suffer because during the war they had chosen to help Jews to survive, which was not necessarily a popular course of action in their hometowns and in their home environments. And so not only were they risking their lives at the time, but they continued to experience negative effects of this choice that they made. And so the Jewish Foundation for the Righteous was established to, in a very small way, attempt to thank them and to make their lives a little bit easier. The other main thrust of the JFR is education, particularly education for teachers. And so every year they create a short documentary. We're not going to watch one today because they're about 15 minutes long, but they film a short documentary telling the story of a Jewish Holocaust survivor and the person who rescued them and how that story unfolded. And then bring your Kleenex, because at the end of each of these documentaries, the survivor and the rescuer are reunited for, in many cases, the first time since the 1940s. The reunion always happens at JFK Airport, and everybody cries, and it's amazing. But they have over 20 years worth of these documentaries available on their website for free. So Esther, if you could go to that. It's jfr.org. It's a really easy website. And they have, if you want to just scroll a little bit, I don't know why they're not in any understandable order. They're just sort of, you can search randomly for years. But Esther, if you'd like to just pick one and click View Page on whichever one, it'll give you kind of a synopsis of the story of who the survivor was, who the rescuer was, what their situation was, and then you get a video clip that you can download. So these are an amazing resource. The JFR website can be a little bit tricky to navigate, so the best way to do this is to go to jfr.org, and then up at the top of the page, up near the top, there's a search box, right up at the top right, and if you just type reunion in there, it'll take you to that list of all of the reunion videos. I don't know why they don't have a direct link, but it's an easy workaround. We use these at the museum all the time, actually, with our teachers and with some of our school groups, and I'm always encouraging teachers to use these in the classroom. They are a phenomenal resource because they really we focus a lot on the experience of survivors, and that is important and good and worthwhile. But looking at the experience of rescuers, I think, is important as well, particularly for our students who can't necessarily relate to the experience of a survivor. The things that they went through are things that are really beyond our comprehension in many cases, but we would all like to see ourselves as being the people who would be the rescuers. Statistics historically show us that that's not actually the way it would work, but to be able to see the experience of a rescuer, who they were, what they went through, what they risked in order to do this, helps us to put that experience into perspective as well. So I encourage you to use these as well. The last thing that I just quickly, we're doing great on time, that's awesome, that I just want to encourage you to do is, in creating film and video, or working with film and video, is to encourage your students to be creative. More and more, we're seeing classrooms incorporating spoken word poetry, having classroom poetry slams. This is an incredibly powerful creative outlet for our students, and it's one that, with the right framing, can be an amazing tool for social justice. When you're having students learn about these really complex subjects, encouraging them not just to create to write reports or history papers, but to think creatively, to create poetry out of their own emotional reactions to this history. This is tough stuff. They are going to react emotionally, and it's okay that they do that, and we need to make a safe space for them to do that. And so giving them a creative outlet can be very, very valuable in that way. But also, we want them to not feel helpless at the end of it. We don't want them to come away from this study thinking, well, people are horrible and the world is a terrible place and we're all doomed, and that's it. We haven't quite done our job if that's where they're coming away. And so we find it really valuable to encourage them to channel that inspiration, that motivation. Things are bad, but I want to do something about it. I want to make the world better. But how do I do that? What is there to do? That was a big question that we had at the museum. And so we created actually a permanent exhibition. It's been open for almost a year and a half now at our museum, called Take a Stand Center. And it's designed to help our visitors to go from knowledge to inspiration to action. And that's a model that you can replicate in your classroom. And the reason that I raise the idea of spoken word poetry is that the last clip I want to leave you with today it's actually a slightly condensed version of the introductory video in our exhibition. I'm seeing some smiles. I think some of you may have seen it already. But this is an original poem that you're going to see, written by
Harold Green, who's the poet laureate of the city of Chicago. He took this concept of turning inspiration into action alongside the stories of the Holocaust survivors whose stories we tell in the museum. And so he's bringing together these different elements into an original work of poetry that he then performed and we turned into this video. So this is, probably slightly higher production values than some of your students will achieve, although some of them I know will knock it out of the park. But this is the kind of approach, the kind of thing that could make a really beautiful culmination to a unit of study, whether it's specifically about the Holocaust or really in any subject area that you're working with. So Esther, if we could show that last video, please.
How strong do you have to be a survivor, to fight on, just so others can live on through your stories, the narrator that never dies? For you listening, may you always stand out and up. Continue to educate. Never think your reach is too short. You're never too young to teach. Create safe communities. Turn clay into pots of gold. Build and rebuild. Create and recreate. Fight for equality. Even when the playing field isn't even. May your individual fights become collective victories. Use your voice. Use your art. Take history to heart. Take a stand for humanity. Never be silenced. Be a survivor. Be an upstander. Be the answer.
And the lovely woman on the far right side of that last group shot, you may have recognized, that was Fritzy, who you heard talking about being barred from school. And the gentleman sitting next to her was Aaron, who I showed you briefly in the eyewitness piece. Alex, do we have a few minutes for questions?
You have 17 minutes for questions.
Please ask me a lot.
But thank you all. I hope this was interesting. But if you have questions, or I can riff, but if you guys have questions, I'd love to have a conversation.
Yeah.
Repeat the question, because we
Yes.
don't have handheld mics. And yeah, use your teacher voices.
Yes.
Teacher voices, and then I will repeat the question. So, yes.
Yeah, I just had a quick question. I'm a foreign language teacher, and some of the sources actually would be very interesting to incorporate in my curriculum. Are there testimony and other sort of short clips in other languages besides English?
The question is if there are testimonies and other clips available in other languages. The answer is yes. Through the Eyewitness platform, there are testimonies in multiple languages that are available. You can filter your search by language, so that can help you to narrow that. They are, in that platform, they are primarily English, but there are testimonies in, I believe, Polish, German, Hebrew, Spanish, and even more. I'm not giving you the full list, but you can absolutely do that. There also are increasingly American-based Holocaust museums are creating materials, particularly in Spanish, that are new, not necessarily historic testimonies and archival pieces, but that are new content. And so those are increasingly available. What language or languages do you teach? French. There are actually a number of survivors in the Chicago area who are native French speakers, who are able to, this is a very limited resource, so please don't ask me to send one to every single one of your classrooms in the same week. But there are survivors who do still speak their native languages, who with enough planning and with enough coordination can potentially speak to a class in French, Spanish, Polish, different languages. So the resources are out there and they're becoming increasingly available. That's definitely a growth area. And we are starting to actually seek out multiple language sources. There was a time when everyone was afraid of subtitles, and so we would sort of ignore non-English sources, but that is very much, it's less the case now, and so non-English sources are becoming increasingly available. Yes?
Are there testimonies from the defendants also?
The question is, are there testimonies from the defendants or from the perpetrators? The answer is yes. These are there are quite a few written testimonies, transcriptions of testimony from the war crimes trials in particular, but there also are sources of just interviews and reflections, memoirs from perpetrators. Yes, Alex?
There's a wonderful film. It's only about 4.5 hours long. It's called The Memory of Justice. If you have an HBO subscription, the film was recently restored by the Martin Scorsese Foundation to its full length. It's by a very famous European filmmaker. I'm forgetting his name, but it has a lot of testimony from Germans who were very high up in the Nazi government, reflecting on what had happened and talking about it very frankly and at length. So it's a wonderful resource for you to go through, and it has survivor testimony as well, of course. So the name of the film is The Memory of Justice.
So it's The Memory of Justice, available through HBO currently. Also, Some Were Neighbors, that online exhibition that I showed you at the beginning. Some of the testimony clips in that are from perpetrators as well. There also are several, again, not necessarily video sources, but written sources of testimony from perpetrators of the Rwandan genocide, the 1994 genocide. That is an area that has been extremely well documented.
Are you a part of the Illinois Holocaust Museum? Do you have a role?
I am a part of the Illinois Holocaust Museum. I'm part of the education department. So I oversee our teacher trainings, our student programs, our field trip programs, our teaching trunk program, our Survivor Speakers Bureau. I'll stick around if you have questions or anything you want to talk about. I'm happy to chat with you.
Are all the states working on Holocaust museums?
The question was with if other states are working on Holocaust museums. The answer is yes and no. There are actually far more Holocaust museums around the country than you probably realize. Many of them are very, very small. We are actually the second largest in the country after the museum in Washington. But currently, two of the most significant Holocaust museums in the country are actually in Houston and in Dallas. And they are both in the process of undergoing major renovations and expansions. We will still be bigger when they're done. But they are really developing their resources in their museum environment. But there are major Holocaust museums in New York. There's several in Florida, in Texas, in California, in Washington State, in Ohio, in Indiana. So we work very closely. We're all independent of each other, but we all know each other. We all work together. We share traveling exhibitions. We share resources. There's a whole network of Holocaust education organizations out there.
Just an FYI, I had an opportunity to go to the Holocaust Museum in Israel.
To Yad Vashem? Wonderful. Yeah, if you have the opportunity to go to Israel and to visit Yad Vashem, the Holocaust Museum in Jerusalem, do it. It is very much worth your time. Thank you for sharing that. Question, yes?
Yeah, I'm sorry if this is a slight aside, but I'm just really curious what kind of work you're doing with the Chicago Police Department. Is it on anti-Semitism specifically, or just like implicit bias in general?
It's so the question, slightly off topic, but I'm happy to answer it, is about the work that we do with the Chicago Police Department. For the last 8+ years, we've been offering training to the Chicago Police Department, as well as suburban law enforcement and the Cook County Sheriff's Department. We offer a day-long training. It's actually 1 day of the Chicago Police Academy, so every recruit comes through our museum and every CPD promotional class. So when officers make rank and become lieutenants or are promoted to sergeants or then become lieutenants, they come for training with us. We spend the day looking at the role of policing in Nazi Germany, the way that the police force was used as a political tool to achieve the Nazis' goals. We look at the role of propaganda in shifting the mindset of the police department, creating the us and them mentality in the population that allowed many of the events of the Holocaust to occur. We look very deeply at the role of the Einsatzgruppen, the mobile killing squads, made up of military and local police who carried out mass executions by bullet, particularly in Eastern Europe. We look at hate crimes. We do kind of a review of hate crimes legislation and the importance of recognizing and documenting incidents as hate crimes. And then they tour our museum and they hear directly from a Holocaust survivor. So our goal for the program is for them to walk away with a renewed, we hope they're coming in with it, but a renewed understanding and recognition of the shared humanity of all citizens that they serve, and to keep that forefront in the way that they engage with their job. We recognize how difficult a job it is, but we know that every one of us has opportunities to do better, and by resisting us and them mindsets in all aspects of our lives, we can help to create more equitable and a more peaceful society. So that's our main thrust
with that program. Any other questions about using survivor testimony or teaching about the Holocaust maybe in non-social studies classrooms? Or
well, let's get back to perpetrators. What about you have testimony from the Russians did their own investigations and they were quite extensive. So we have is it like set up so you can understand it in English? Captions?
Yeah.
So the question is going back to the topic of perpetrators, and particularly the investigations and the trials conducted by the Soviet Union. The Holocaust, as it occurred in Eastern Europe, in the areas that after the war were behind the Iron Curtain, is an area of study that is really just opening up to us. Because the Soviet archives were not open to Western scholars until after the fall of communism, it's an area that is just really starting to be tapped into, and we are learning so much, and there's so much scholarship and understanding of what the Holocaust looked like in the Soviet Union, which was very, very different from what we think of as happening in Central and Western Europe. It's funny, we tend to think of Poland as being Eastern Europe, but in Holocaust terms, it was actually the center. It was much more Central Europe, but in our Western understanding, occupied Poland was about as far as it went because we didn't have any access to information about what happened in the Soviet territories because archival information were not available to us, and the survivors in that area remained in the Soviet Union. We didn't have access to their testimonies, and in many cases, they weren't giving testimonies because under the Soviet system, they were discouraged from talking about it and continued to suffer anti-Semitism. And so that's an area that's just starting to be addressed and translated and to become accessible. So we have actually the largest subset of Holocaust survivors in the Chicago area are survivors from the former Soviet Union. It's almost 80% of the survivors in the Chicago area are those who came to the United States between the late 70s and today, either in the 70s coming out of the Soviet Union as refuseniks or coming after the fall of communism. And so we are just starting to learn their stories and to document their testimony. Language is a barrier, but we and other institutions are working with translators, recording, documenting, and trying to access that information. In terms of perpetrator trials and records in the Soviet Union, those are materials that Western historians are just starting to be able to tap into. And so that's an area that right now there's limited availability, but in the next 5 years or so, we're going to see an explosion of resources on that specific subject. Yes?
Do you have in any of these resources any testimonies of what you mentioned, the people in the middle? In your video, I don't know, the ones who shave the heads, I don't see them as people in the middle. Those are on the bad side. So my point is what we call usually in Syria the silent majority. So any testimonies of those people or revisiting how were they thinking at the time?
Yeah, it's a great question. He's asking about testimony of, we've talked about survivor testimony and perpetrator testimony, but what about the people in the middle? For example, in the video that I showed you of the public shaming, like the man shaving their heads, or the people participating in that as an audience who would be in that kind of moral gray area. The answer is, unfortunately, there's not much available about those individuals, because actually convincing them to sit down for an interview is difficult, because there hasn't been an emphasis on documenting those stories. At this point, enough time has passed that there aren't as many of those individuals available to give testimony anymore, but in the kind of years when the main thrust of documenting testimony was happening, those gray area people, unfortunately, were not the priority. And I agree with you. I think that would be a fascinating source that unfortunately we have very little of. There are a couple of written sources of people who sort of came around, like realized and had a change of heart after the fact. Many of you may be familiar with Pastor Niemöller. First they came for the trade unionists, and I did not speak up, et cetera, and then they came for me, and there was no one left to speak up for me. The gentleman who wrote that poem was a Lutheran pastor in Germany who actually was was pretty anti-Semitic and was actually he collaborated with the Nazi regime, and then only after himself ending up in a labor camp and seeing how much worse the Jewish prisoners were treated and really understanding the impact of what these policies were having, did he have his change of heart. And so that poem was written from personal experience, where he recognized what was happening. He didn't speak out because it didn't directly affect him personally, and only too late did he realize the larger implications of that. And so that's not exactly what you're asking about, but that's off the top of my head, that's the closest example that I'm thinking of. We are good. Well, thank you. One more? Do we have one more? I can take one more. Or we can wrap up here, and that's good too, because everybody likes lunch. So, all right, well, thank you so much. I'll stick around.
If any of you have more